Welcome back. It's been 20 years since the United States' worst terrorist attack killed nearly 3,000 people. More than 2,600 of the victims were killed at the World Trade Center in New York after Al-Qaeda militants crashed planes into the Twin Towers. Another plane was rammed into the Pentagon in the Washington area. A fourth plane crashed in Pennsylvania at around 10:03 that morning after passengers fought back against the Al-Qaeda hijackers. It was after those attacks then that the United States President at the time, George W. Bush, announced a war in Afghanistan from where Al-Qaeda leader Osama Bin Laden is believed to have directed those 9/11 attacks. Professor John Stremlau teaches international relations at Wits University and joins us live now from Johannesburg to talk more about this anniversary. Prof, afternoon, welcome to Newsfeed PM. And I suppose 20 years, a massive anniversary made even more significant by the recent events in Afghanistan.
Yes, it is a time for reflection, and I hope Americans are doing that, because the first response was quite a success. It had international support, and it was to root out the Al-Qaeda forces that were responsible for the attack on New York and Washington. But then it changed into a strategic nation-building project that was flawed both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So here we are 20 years later, and it is a time for reflection after the failures of Afghanistan at nation building, after the failures of Iraq. But whether Americans are up for that kind of discussion is an open question.
And it raises, doesn't it, the question about the level of success of what George W. Bush had termed at the time a war on terror. Some say we've just seen in Afghanistan the resurgence of the Taliban. It is now, in fact, the government of the day in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, yes, may not be as strong as it was at its peak, but it continues to exist years after what America says was the killing of Osama Bin Laden. So how successful was what happened in 2001 from the Americans?
Well, life goes on and things change, and the Islamic world is very different from what it was 20 years ago. At that time, there was a lot more sympathy in the Islamic world for the more radical elements than there is today. At the same time, we've seen these terrorist offshoots spread across the Sahel and into Nigeria and now down to Mozambique, so that it's been diffused, and it's a very perplexing situation that I just want to recall. International community did support the immediate response to the immediate threat, just as the international community supported George Bush the Senior's Desert Storm operation to reverse Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, breaking the rules, breaking the norms. But what America has mistaken was to carry forward into what was for Bush Jr. and for Rumsfeld, who was then a Defense Department, and Vice President Dick Cheney, a kind of a strategic nation-building project that was doomed, I think, in retrospect, to failure. They didn't prove the nuclear weapons were in Iraq, and they certainly were unable to make the 300,000 modern army that they did a turnkey operation for in Afghanistan, into a fighting force, nor was the government sustainable. So it is a period for reflection, but it's also a period for South African reflection, because I was here when the 9/11 attacks occurred. My wife was in Washington and working a block from the White House, so that I was very concerned in retrospect that plane that you mentioned in Pennsylvania might have been heading for the White House and might have hurt my wife.
Mm-hmm. And that was precisely it, wasn't it? We talk often about the politics, the diplomacy, the war, the international relations, but on that day, thousands of innocent people lost their lives, over 2,900 of them, and we are still grappling with the question of whether the subsequent events have gone far enough in trying to do right by the families and survivors.
Yes, you raise a good question. I'm not familiar with how much is actually being done for the families of the survivors, but there certainly is a lot in the newspapers in the U.S. today about the ongoing effects of this catastrophe for them. However, what you point out is that there were nearly 3,000 people killed in the World Trade Center, but just last year there were 600,000 Americans lost to COVID. And it's estimated by public health officials that 400,000 of those died needlessly because of the bad policies of, in this case, the Trump administration to do the kind of protocols that we're so serious about down here, to make sure that the vaccines were legitimate and accepted by everyone as best you could. And you're reminded that there are relative threats of security, and I would say that the big three right now are COVID, climate change, and cyber. And none of them are really dealt with by the kind of strategic debate that is going on in the U.S. military and political leadership in the United States. I mean, Biden has increased the Defense Department budget this year. It's $762 billion, more than the 11 closest nations. What does that get you? It's a question that ought to be debated.
And just on that point, yes, you've got the health emergency in the form of COVID, right? Joe Biden, in speaking about the U.S. withdrawal, said a time had come when the United States had to stop trying to remake other countries through military means. But that message itself is very much dependent on who is the president of the day in the United States, given how the government is structured, correct?
Absolutely. One thing we're learning, and I confess this as an international relations scholar who often thought about structural issues when it seemed like the world was a more stable place in the Cold War, structural variables, when in fact it's leadership. Just think of the differences between Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, and Cyril Ramaphosa. We as citizens need to take a more careful look at the quality of our leadership and exercise our franchise in a more informed way. That's piety, of course. But I think South Africa is really, in many ways, an exemplar of a country trying to build a democracy with enormous inequalities. And America is 300 years or 230 years into the experiment, and they're still struggling with it as well. And it does impact greatly on the foreign policies of the nation. And I think both Cyril Ramaphosa and Joe Biden recognize that the health of the domestic political system is what drives a successful foreign policy, not just thinking only in terms of international relations.
But how, if at all, have the events of 9/11 shifted as far as the terror threat to the United States? Is it a safer country 20 years on?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I've been reading the debates going on in the U.S. media in the last couple of days, and conservatives will argue that a stronger defense and hardware is the answer. Liberals will argue that the answer is more software and more addressing such issues as climate change, which are the real looming security threats to humanity. But the debate has not yet been reconciled, and America is very, very polarized. And I think you are right to follow events there and ask the question: how much did 9/11 make the situation worse? Remember, on September 10th, 2001, we thought end of apartheid, end of the Cold War, China reforming economically. Gee, the world was going to be a much more liberal, more placid place. But, America has yet to struggle with a lot of the contradictions of its own domestic life. And the 9/11 is just a moment to reflect on that and ask the question, has the country gone off the wrong track in response to 9/11? I think in many ways it has, but that's a complicated and a big argument.
I want to stay for a moment again with the link between Afghanistan and the events of 9/11, because the war in Afghanistan was a direct consequence when the United States said it was going to seek out Osama Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda from inside Afghanistan. We also saw in August the attack carried out by ISIS-K outside the Kabul airport. Among those killed were U.S. Marines. In reaction to that, President Biden basically vowed to seek revenge, and we saw a drone strike in a matter of hours after that. How does the United States then go after groups such as ISIS-K, if it is indeed their place to do so, without exposing its citizens at home and abroad to increased risk of retaliation from these groups?
Well, again, on the 9/11, in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a response that I think is justified and appropriate. And I don't quibble with the use of the drones in the case of what ISIS-K did in Kabul airport. What I do fault was in the aftermath of 9/11, once you had dealt with Al-Qaeda, rather than isolate the Taliban, they should have engaged the Taliban. I mean, Afghanistan is a very complicated a country that has not been conquered by the British in the 19th century, or the Russians, Soviets in the 20th century, or the Americans in the 21st century. You've got to understand the terrain in which you're working. You cannot just import your own solutions, which is what, unfortunately, the mission in Afghanistan transformed itself into. I think Biden is right to get out. I know there's a lot of controversy over how he got out, but I do think that the strategic decision to get out now and to start afresh and to take a multilateral approach. For example, China and Afghanistan are developing really interesting relations, even though China is suppressing, and I criticize China for suppressing Muslims in what is a shared common border. It's only 76 kilometers between Afghanistan and China. And yet the Afghanistan regime now, the Taliban, wants to engage China for its own consolidation reasons. And I think that the U.S. should also engage the Taliban. Mm-hmm. I think South Africa's approach to, you can talk to everyone, keep your own principles, adapt to changing circumstances, is the right approach.
How would you say then, politicians aside, how would you say the events of 9/11 and what's happened subsequent to that globally, with the link to the tragedy itself, has reshaped the ways and the thinking of ordinary Americans?
That's a good question, but you know, it's very hard to know. I've seen the polling data on this, and people get distracted with other issues. You know, they're interested in jobs. They're interested in the growth of the economy. The attitudes toward terrorism, they supported overwhelmingly the withdrawal and end of the endless war in Afghanistan. They're not happy with the way it was done. They are concerned about the proliferation of ISIS affiliates and of Al-Qaeda affiliates. But are they really interested in what's happening on Mozambique? Not really. But are South Africans interested in Mozambique? You bet they are, mm-hmm. as are all of the other neighbors. And I really think you're in a situation where you have to focus on what it is that concerns the citizens in the greatest proximity that they have to the problem, and the closest proximity. And it really is a question of collective action, both in Africa and in the U.S., in Afghanistan now, and in the way in which the Middle East is evolving. You know, the nuclear deal with Iran was a good example, that Obama put together a coalition and it exercised restraint. Mm. These are fundamental questions that 9/11 should remind us of, because going off and responding to that attack was the right thing to do, but turning it into a nation-building project was the wrong thing to do. And so you do learn these fundamental lessons, I think.
Professor John Stremlau, good to speak to you, from Wits University, teaches international relations, speaking to us about the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We've got much more coverage for you. We've been showing you live picture. In fact, during our conversation with the Prof from New York City, the memorial is what we had on earlier. These are more of the pictures as we watch. I think we see in picture former President Barack Obama. I see President Biden And former First Lady Michelle Obama also in picture, and current First Lady Jill Biden. They're making their way there as America marks 20 years since one of its bloodiest chapters, at least domestically. Over 2,900 people killed on this day 20 years ago as 4 planes were used in terrorist attacks, 2 of them crashing into the Twin Towers in New York, another in Washington at the Pentagon, another crashing in Pennsylvania as crew and passengers wrestled the hijackers on that day. It crashed into a field. So we're going to see much more of these commemoration events in the United States today and possibly throughout the weekend. We'll continue to dip in and out of proceedings as they unfold.